Welcome everyone for tuning into the latest economic outlook with critical look into the pressing economic signals most impacted by COVID-19, commonly referred to as coronavirus. Preventary provides economic-based predictive analytic solutions that power intelligent forecasting. Our mission remains focused on helping businesses understand the economic landscape to make the most informed decisions. And to begin today's update, it feels essential to first recognize the impact that COVID-19 is having as a health crisis on lives around the world. We want to ensure that as a company, we acknowledge the effects of the coronavirus that it's having on human beings, as well as the immense complexity in combating and stabilizing the spread of this virus. As a technology solution that powers intelligent forecasting to provide business leaders real-time insights, we hope that our efforts provide some level of comfort as we all continue to navigate through this unprecedented time. On the line with me today is Preventary's Chief Economist, Andrew Duguay. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you for taking the time to provide further updates on what feels like a very fast evolving economic situation. Last week alone, we saw several major global and domestic events that may have impact on future economic performance, from additional travel bans, news of expanding COVID-19 cases throughout Europe and the United States, and COVID-19 was actually declared a pandemic. This is a lot to ingest. And while we can't predict the course of any virus, we can interpret incoming data combined with known data to discuss these findings. And Andrew, with that, it feels like a natural time to turn this presentation over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Since we communicated last week, as you mentioned, the World Health Organization has declared the coronavirus a global pandemic. The US has declared a national state of emergency. Cumulative cases in the US have more than doubled in 3 days. So naturally, the risk to the US and the global economies has risen significantly in a short period of time, and that likelihood for an economic downturn has in turn escalated. So today we're going to talk about some of the areas of concern and look at some of the key indicators that we are watching at Preventary to continue to be data-driven in our analysis and help our customers navigate these uncertain times. So there are many things to consider right now. It's actually pretty clear today that consumption in the US will be down in the first quarter, or at least rapidly decelerate from normal levels. We are seeing some stock up in consumer segments at the grocery store at the moment, but when we take that into the broader consideration of all the events that have been canceled and all the disruptions to the economy, we expect overall consumer spending to be a net negative at this point. I think we are beyond the point where we'll just make this up in the second quarter due to pent-up demand, as many were originally hoping when this crisis started to take hold. There have been so many canceled events and impacts on supply chains that it's no longer reasonable to assume that we're just going to see a resumption of growth in the second quarter to make up for the decline that we are seeing in the first quarter and in primarily March. Now, the natural lag in collecting and releasing data is causing many struggles in our field to quantify the current and future impacts that the virus is having on the economy. Domestic concerns about the virus were not really escalated until the final few days of February, making a lot of the February statistical releases not a proper signal of the impact that is going on today in the US economy. As we look for measures of the health of the US economy, one of the indicators we like to look at is the US Purchasing Managers Index, shown here in the red and purple lines. What we can see is an economy that overall in the US was growing up through February, but manufacturing was under threat and even signaling some weakness or potential decline. What was holding the US economy afloat through the first couple months of 2020 was the services sector and consumer spending, shown here in the purple line. The interesting context we have for looking at where these indicators go is actually quite negative right now. When we look at the China Purchasing Managers Index, as well as the Global Purchasing Managers Indexes, what we see is that once the pandemic takes hold, we see not only disruptions to supply chain, manufacturing, logistics, which would be represented in the red line, but also equal, if not escalated, downturns in the services sector, which is the purple line. This poses a unique threat to the US economy and our rate of economic growth, as we expected some weakness in manufacturing in 2020, but largely we were expecting the consumer to hold up the US economy through at least the first half of the year, and now that appears to be under increasing threat. If we look at measures such as in China or in the global indicators on the same data set for Purchasing Managers Index, we see that the February data was already negative. If you go to the next slide. All right, so already negative. For those economies that were impacted by COVID-19, what we see is sharp declines both in the manufacturing and in the services sector, as obviously supply chains get disrupted, but we also see travel bans and social distancing impact consumer spending habits and the services sector alongside with it. We should expect similar declines in the US as we are starting to escalate our response to the spread of the virus by implementing many of the same measures that other countries are forced to implement by canceling large gatherings of public events. This obviously has implications on the US economy in ways that we could not have necessarily foreseen or implemented in baseline economic projections merely a few weeks ago. But given the gravity of the situation and how it's spreading into the US as it has in other countries, this is the right social response to the health crisis, and therefore the economic consequences we can learn from these measures, from some of these global indicators, as well as from other countries that have seen the escalation and the rise of cases sooner than the US has. When it comes to the indicators to watch, the Purchasing Managers Index is a good one, but as we advise our customers and Previdary subscribers, we are really focusing on 4 key areas for which to say, let's look at some broad economic implications, measure the implications against your own data, and look for potential leading signals of a downturn if you have not felt it, or potential recovery when that recovery comes around the corner. When we think about areas of the economy that are going to be impacted, these are the 4 key areas we come up with. One is consumer strength. So this can be a measure of travel and tourism, which we know has been strongly impacted as conferences, concerts, and business travel has been largely been put on hold for the foreseeable future. But we can also look at the consumer for other measures. During times of heightened uncertainty, we might see temporary increases in sales at grocery stores. However, we should really be looking and paying attention to big ticket purchase items such as autos and homes. When we looked at the same data for China last week, what we saw is some of the more significant declines from the Chinese consumer were in real estate, followed by automobiles. We could expect to see signals of similar negativity in the US, and we'll be anticipating some of the data releases from the retail sales. We've already had some early releases on consumer sentiment, and we've seen that attitudes have shifted from near record highs as the US consumer was in a particular happy place before these events happened and transpired, to a much more conservative consumer. And I think these consumer attitudes will show up in how they spend. So we have future releases here that we are going to be looking forward to, including the all-important Census Bureau's retail sales release coming out on March 17th. For our Previdary customers, you know that your workbenches are set up with some of these leading indicators, and that as the data gets released, your models and indicators will get released as well, and very important to keep and monitor. As we look to other areas that are going to be impacted, we think logistics and manufacturing was one of those early areas that was already threatened in 2020. And then by the Chinese supply chain disruptions, we were also seeing some threats to manufacturing. Now those threats are becoming much more domestic related. We've seen and talked about the fall in oil prices is going to have significant impacts to oil, petroleum, distribution, refining areas of the US economy. But then other areas of manufacturing are still going to be impacted by global supply chain disruptions. Even as China goes online, we are seeing disruptions coming out of Europe, and then we're going to have more disruptions domestically as work from home policies and different factors come into play with our production capacity. We'll be looking for additional releases, including that all-important Purchasing Managers Index coming up later this month on the 24th. Business investment is one of those areas where we have to look at what are going to happen to jobs. And this is a big question mark for the US economy. If this social distancing and some of this public gathering shutdown continues on for too long, we could be talking about a large difference between temporary job displacement. In other words, picture a restaurant worker who is now serving half the amount of attendees and getting half the amount of tips as they normally would get, versus actually losing jobs, people getting laid off from jobs in the travel and tourism industry. That would be a huge significant change in the structure of the US economy and really disrupt this tight unemployment environment that we've had the luxury of being in for the last 5 years. We aren't quite there yet, but what we need to pay attention to are important releases around jobless claims, new job openings, or even measures of the number of hours or overtime hours worked to get a good sense of what businesses are going to do to react to this crisis. Will they take the long approach and view this as temporary, hold on to as many employees as possible, or are things going to escalate to a more severe level where we actually have these structural adjustments where people are getting displaced from their jobs permanently? If the latter happens, there would be a higher likelihood that we would need federal government assistance to step in to help this from turning into a larger economic crisis that could continue far beyond the peak amount of virus containment in the future. On the financial side, a lot of this data we look at because the financial data gets published in real time, and a lot of times it's a great measure of the attitudes and sentiment of the business community, the financial community, as well as personal investors. And what we've seen is a lot of very troubling measures, right, from the financial markets with the increased volatility, the increased spreads between high risk and low risk assets, as people are basically pricing in the higher likelihood of an economic downturn and risk and default amongst businesses that might not have optimal credit. We look to all of these things and look at them in historic context. What we are seeing is that the markets are being disrupted in ways that we see typically associated with recessions. And if this continues, the risk in the financial markets could also spread and have secondary and tertiary effects on the total US economy outside the virus specifically. So we're looking for areas of the economy that are going to be directly impacted by virus sicknesses or policies meant to distance people from each other. And then we're also looking for some secondary impacts here from data sets to say, boy, are we looking at a swift recovery after we contain the virus, or is this going to spread into some further economic ramifications down the road? I think that could be the difference between seeing relatively stable or strong growth in the second half of 2020 versus seeing a prolonged recession that extends from the first and second quarter out into the third quarter or beyond.
Wow, thank you, Andrew. A lot to consider here. So we appreciate the assessment as the global and domestic economic landscape is changing throughout this pandemic. Appreciate all the insights that you provided here today. Very different insight into the status of the economy versus just a week ago even. So that concludes this economic update, and stay tuned for our announcements as we'll be following up this update, as Andrew mentioned, as there are developments. Our thoughts are with all of you and your families, as well as the many scientists and healthcare providers working on the problems that we're all facing. And of course, should you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can put you either in touch with one of our economists. Andrew and his team are fantastic. My name is Nicole Flynn. My email is on the screen right now, nflynn@prevadaria.com, and we're happy to hear from you. Thank you, everybody, and this concludes today's presentation.